All right. Hello and welcome everyone to the Building an Autism Friendly Environment webinar. My name is Beth Yates, and I am the Children's Consultant from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. And I will be the host and question moderator for today. And our presenter for today is Bev Harp, Project Director for Innovative Supports for Autistic Workers, which is a project of the Human Development Institute, and is also self-advocate faculty for LEND at the University of Kentucky, amongst many other wonderful projects and qualifications. And I'll let them tell you a little bit more about themselves as we get into it. To register for other webinars or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library, and it's under Services for Libraries. This session is 1 hour, so you're eligible to receive 1 LEU for this presentation. And if you're watching a recording of this webinar, instructions on how to obtain your LEU are in the video's description on YouTube. Or you can also find those instructions on the Indiana State Library's continuing education site under LEU policies. But in short, when you watch a recording, your director or someone in HR should create a certificate for you, as they're the ones who can verify that you watched. Okay, I think that is all from me. I think we're ready to get started. Again, our presenter today is Bev Harp, so please take it away, Bev.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's good to see everybody here. I am an autistic self-advocate and grew up without a diagnosis because in the 60s and 70s, when I was a child, autism was considered extremely rare. 1 in 10,000 people were thought to have a thing called autism, and it didn't apply to kids like me who got called other things like weird or shy. And there were just no supports or understanding in those days. As I learned about myself as an adult and that I was autistic and what that meant and what I could do with it, that allowed me to reframe my history, which had all been working in retail and restaurant work until I was around almost 40. And then I went back to school and got a degree in social work and stayed and got my master's in social work and started working at the Human Development Institute, where my main responsibilities are training employers and doing consultations with employers and any other type of organization that wants to learn more about working with autistic people, especially in terms of communication. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to get into some basics of autism that maybe no one has ever told you. If you know what is in the diagnostic criteria, then you know something about what autism looks like, but perhaps not about what it is. So I'm going to lift the curtain on that today and then talk about how that relates to what gets called autistic behavior and what can we look at that's a little bit bigger than the idea of behavior. Then we're going to get into the sensory considerations, how to make your environment, your physical environment accessible. But because environment means a lot more than the physical space, we're going to go on to talk about communication. And finally, I will give you some recommendations for books that your library might want to add for all ages, children, adults, fiction, nonfiction, and to talk a little bit about how to choose books. So on to the basics. First of all, the autistic brain is different. This is a thing that surprisingly few people seem to be aware of. And of course, that has a lot to do with the research on this based on brain scans coming much later than the behavior-based diagnosis. So there's now a big confusion about what are we talking about when we talk about autism? Are we talking about this list of traits that are observable, which is the way I think most people think of autism? Or are we talking about what's really going on inside this person that is generating what we see? So if we look at brain scans of autistic people, we find all kinds of differences. Not just one thing is different, but all different parts of the brain have differences. The amygdala, for example, tends to be larger in children than average, and in adults, it can tend to be smaller than children, which may say something about the growth of the amygdala along with the rest of the brain throughout the lifespan. But the important thing about that is that it provokes that fight or flight response, and explains a lot of where that anxiety comes from. The hippocampus stores a lot of our memory, and you might be aware that autistic people can have incredible long-term memories, but we can struggle really hard with short-term memory. Um, about 50% of people who are autistic also have an ADHD diagnosis. So there is just a lot of overlap in that area of executive functioning problems with planning, organizing, getting started with things, completing things. Then if we look at the corpus callosum, that is the dividing line between the left and right brain. So uh, in autistic people, it tends to be thinner than in neurotypical people, which means that information is moving from one part of the brain to the other more easily, which is just, it can be a fantastic thing for creative thinking. And it can be also very frustrating when you are trying to stay in one zone or the other. Um, if I didn't have a job where it was beneficial to uh, go off on tangents and find things that connect to the main topic, then I might be in trouble because tangents are my life. That's where the good stuff is. That's where you find what you're really looking for, off the beaten path. But all these areas have some differences. The most significant difference to me is the hyperconnectivity in the autistic brain. When we are young, our brain is constantly building connections and then tearing them down. This is called pruning. So we have constant neural networks being built, all of these superhighways across the brain. And as we gain more experience and our brain decides what they are going to use most and what it's going to use a little bit less, some of those connections are taken out. So that does not happen to the same extent in autistic children. And of course, brain development continues throughout the lifespan and pretty intensely through the early 20s, and then kind of tapers off. But that building and pruning starts early, and most of the work is done in those early years. So what this does is it causes a lot of traffic of ideas, and that can lead to confusion. And the thing about sensory experience for autistic people is that sounds are much louder and bright things are much brighter and patterned things are much more patterny, and everything is insisting upon our full attention at all times. So if I'm trying to have a conversation with one person, but there is another conversation going on way across the room, those words are likely to get mixed into like a combination. And again, this is fantastic if you want to write a poem or a story, and it can be really difficult if you are really trying to focus on one thing. It might not be a natural thing to me to pay 90% of my attention to the person in front of me and 10% to the environment, but to pay attention to all of those things equally. which can make the person feel like they're being ignored when they're not. Because I'm pretty good at processing all those different things. Yet, uh, imagine that you have all of these sights and sounds yelling at you constantly, and how exhausting that would be to try to have to filter it out consciously in the ways that your brain probably does it if you are not neurodivergent, if you're fairly neurotypical. And I know there's no such thing as exactly neurotypical. This is just the word we use to say you're pretty close to the norm. You're not anywhere near a standard deviation away from the center of that bell curve. You're neurotypical. If that's the case for you, then it may be hard to understand and remember that there is there's a very noisy concert going on in the brain of the person that you're trying to speak to. So it's these differences of the brain that cause us to perceive and think and communicate differently, not some behavior that we're doing for some motivated reason. And the fact is that autistic people are almost constantly in a state of fight, flight, or freeze when we're around other people. That doesn't mean that we don't enjoy being around people or that we are antisocial. It means that we have a really hard time. Another thing that you need to know to understand autistic people is about the spiky cognitive profile. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. You might have had a subject in school you were really excellent in, such as literature, and a subject that you were not so great in. For me, that would be math, I guess. But as far as my really, really weakest areas, I think I got like 13% on the the PSAT part, where you have to look at a folded up box and look at the unfolded version of it and match it up and say, oh, this looks like this. Spatial understanding is not within my grasp. Um, I can read a map, I understand the map, but yet I just came back from a conference in DC yesterday. The hotel where I was staying was 2/10 of a mile from the hotel where the conference was being held. But the first time I walked over there, it took me 30 minutes because I didn't go in one wrong direction. I went in every possible wrong direction while holding on to the map app on my phone. I still couldn't get there. So the difference here is that the autistic person's strengths may be a higher spike. This is where you see some really, some autistic people have um, a very noticeable talent in one area. Savantism is not that common. Uh, I've heard numbers like 10%, but I don't think that it's really that high if you're strict about the definition of, like, looking for somebody who might have been called a prodigy. But many autistic people have an area of strength where they can develop and become very, very good at one or two things. And our valleys tend to be really low. Like most people can do better than 12 or 13% on folding up a box. Another thing to know about autism is that we tend to be bottom up processors, whereas we live in a society of top down processing. Um, most people are top down processors, and that means when going into a new situation, you are carrying with you all the information about your previous experiences, uh, expectations of what that situation is going to be like. You're able to transfer a lot of knowledge, but that also might cause you to make assumptions that are not true and to not even know that you should maybe be questioning those assumptions. A bottom up thinker comes into the situation and starts with observation. It's very data driven, it's sensory driven. Um, I'm going to come into the room and I'm going to see what's in the room and I'm going to analyze, okay, this looks like what's going on is some kind of a meeting or conference, not whereas a top-down processor will know that before they even open the door, but we'll have certain expectations about how things are going to go, whereas mine will develop as we go along. It takes place in real time. Autistic people tend to do well with staying on one topic at a time. Um, Things that are not really in our focus area might as well not exist or will be considered distractions. And we may be very, very offended if you try to call our attention to something that is not in our current area of focus. It can just take extra processing time to get there. So, you know that if you have an autistic person in your family, when you get ready to go somewhere and it's someplace new or unfamiliar, that you're going to describe what's going on. You're going to tell them what to expect. If it's a big deal, like going on a plane trip for the first time, you're going to try to practice that. You're going to at least have them know where the airport is. You're going to maybe watch movies or shows about flying and hopefully be able to go in and do a walkthrough. In Kentucky, we have a program where families can take their kids to the airport on certain days to check out the planes and see what the security line is like and all of that kind of stuff. And that's great preparation. It's not that we are just stubborn and insist on doing our favorite thing all the time. It's literally the way our brains are built. This is what we are born to do, is to focus on that one thing. Okay, so that covers chapter 1, the basics, and I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions in the chat or if anybody would like to ask me anything about that before we move on. Okay, next, let's talk about what we like to call behaviors and some dangerous assumptions that are made sometimes about behaviors. One is that they're doing this on purpose, or my absolute least favorite, oh, they're doing it for attention. Um, Among self-advocates, when we talk about this, we talk about connection seeking. The whole idea of attention seeking should be thrown out the window. It's connection seeking. Everybody is looking for connections with other people. Whether you're autistic or neurotypical, we are built for that. I also will assume that if a child is acting out or not doing what we want, that they have the ability to do what they're being asked to do, and therefore they must be choosing not to. And the biggest and worst assumption I think we make is that the behavior itself is the problem. Say, for example, the problem is a behavior of saying, I hate you, and you really need the person to stop doing that. So you coach them to not say that, and they stop saying it. Is the problem solved? Your problem is solved. Same deal here with screaming in the library. Uh, I'll give you a piece of candy. You stop screaming. That won't work with a real meltdown. But is the problem solved when they stop screaming? Your problem is solved. It's now quiet. But have you figured out why the person was upset? Why they were so upset that they needed to express that they hated another person or that they needed to scream in a public place? These aren't things that you would choose to do. Why would you assume that they are things that anyone would choose to do? These are things that happen for reasons. And when we stop at behavior and we're satisfied with getting what we want out of that behavior and we don't move on, the problem is not solved. It goes underground and it will come back out again. Next time, the screaming will be louder. Next time, we will hate everyone. Um, and in this example here, this person does some head banging when they're upset. They bang their head against the wall, and the adult in the picture is calling this a challenging behavior. What's really going on is that this person isn't able to speak and has a terrible toothache. A lot of times with head banging, the problem is pain. Now, that can be physical pain or it can be emotional or psychological pain. But if there is self injury of any kind, it's a response to pain and to not having a better way to express that. Sometimes not having a better way to express something is because, oh, I don't speak. And the only way you understand people's communication is if they speak. And sometimes it's the learned expectation that what I say doesn't make any difference. And usually if you can tell your parent or guardian that your mouth hurts, you will get taken to the dentist. But this is true for more children than those who would get a similar solution to the problem of saying my feelings are hurt. And what if you can't say that? What if you can't say that because either you don't use speech to communicate and no one else has learned your way of communication yet, or you have the condition that we call alexithymia, which means not being able to put words and emotions together, which is an extremely common thing that we see with autism. A meltdown is not a tantrum and cannot be treated as a tantrum. The reason I'm talking about all this, I forgot to say, is that when I did this presentation for librarians in Kentucky, they were very focused on groups for youth and how to handle any problem situations that come up in those kinds of groups. So we needed to talk about meltdowns. And the most important thing to remember is it's not a tantrum. A tantrum is goal oriented and it's intentional. I want a piece of candy and I'm going to scream until you give me a piece of candy. But if I'm having a meltdown, that's completely different. And nothing that you can give me is going to make it better after a certain point. So, what would be a less dangerous assumption? Um, we can listen to Ross Green, who has done a whole lot of work on this topic and related topics. And Ross Green tells us that kids do well if they can. So it is least dangerous to assume that the child wants to do well and that they will do well when given the resources and skills that they need to do that, when given a tolerable environment within which they are able to do that. So instead of a behavior oriented question like, how can I get this person to stop what they're doing? We can turn that around and make it a person centered question. How can I support this person to have an enjoyable and productive time in this setting? Now I've changed everything. I've not just changed the opportunity to get the behavior back in line, but I've opened up the doors to actual understanding between myself and the person. And I've reminded myself, as the professional, in this case, a librarian maybe, or someone who runs a similar program. I'm reminding myself why I got into this in the first place. We all face this with work. I do too. Um, it's no different for me because I'm autistic. I still get, I find it difficult sometimes to keep my focus on why I'm doing this when I get overwhelmed and I get frustrated and somebody is pushing my buttons and triggers and I feel like I might have a meltdown. It's hard for me to remember that what I'm here for is to make people's lives better, not to um, take care of the immediate problem, which is too much noise and everybody being unhappy about there being too much noise. That is such a small problem as far as the scope of problems that autistic people face in the world and that everybody faces, really. Um, but now, by turning this back into a person-centered question, it's my focus has changed. It's changed back to, oh yeah, this is the goal. This is why I'm doing this with my life. So the next thing we need to do is manage our own expectations. Autism is what we call a dynamic disability, which means its abilities fluctuate. Today, I'm having a really good speaking day. When I'm having a harder day with speech, the pauses are a lot longer and a lot more frequent. And I lose track many times over the course of a conversation. Uh, I do much better with presentations than I do with conversations because I use scripts. You've probably heard of echolalia and think of it as a way that some autistic people will communicate by using words from a TV show or movie or song. Another way that we use them is to have, once I've learned how to have a certain conversation about, what do you do for a living? I have a little script that goes with that I can tell people, and I don't have to, as when speaking extemporaneously, I don't have to seek out every individual word and think about how to order them in order for it to make sense to someone. So it's not just speech that this applies to, but some days we are just able to perform across the board in ways that on other days we're not. And that creates problems when there's an expectation that because I could do this task perfectly well on Wednesday, I can also do it on Saturday. To understand this, imagine yourself in a classroom and you're being asked to work on a math problem. And it is at the level of the most difficult level of math that you have succeeded at, and you haven't done it in a while. You probably can do it, but you're going to need to concentrate. So you sit down at a desk with your pencil and you start working. And then someone comes in and they start flipping the lights on and off, on and off, on and off. And suddenly the room is 40 degrees. And the next thing you know is a marching band starts marching through the room, and the tuba is right in your ear. How are you doing on that problem now? Remember what I said about everything being louder and brighter for autistic people. We are often in that state where things are just way too intense. And it's cumulative. If my day has included lots of time for stimming and flapping and self-care and um, not too much time of being in meetings with multiple people and having lots of conversations, that's going to be a very, very different day from the one that's a busy and intense day. That's the same for neurotypical people. Just ramp it up a little bit. When you think about autism, think about turning that dial all the way up to 10. That's the way it is. So understand that someone is not necessarily lying to you when they say, I just can't today. There are times when we really can't. All right. So a meltdown, this is how it happens. Um, First of all, everybody comes with their own personal history that is going to have an effect on how this goes. And also, I could have put down here neurology. So all of that stuff that's inside you is like your launching pad. Then there needs to be preparation. If that preparation piece doesn't happen, then we may go into one of these other boxes. One thing that can happen, it might start with sensory overwhelm. It's too loud in here. It's too cold in here. I'm very, very uncomfortable. Or it could be the reverse. The expectation could come first. There's an expectation that can't be met, whether it's sit here quietly or fill out all the answers on this test or take out the garbage. If that expectation can't be met at this time, then that's going to add to that sensory overwhelm, and it's building, it's building. And at this point, it becomes too late to address the problem. And this is where things get really messed up when somebody steps in and tries to address the problem in an unhelpful way. One of those unhelpful ways is to, manage the person's behavior uh, by providing reinforcement or punishment or whatever it is that you do when you want to control someone's behavior. Sometimes you might get what you want from that, or you might appear to get what you want from that momentarily. But what's going on inside that person at this point, after the overwhelm and lack of preparation and the expectations that they can't meet, there is such a sense of isolation and need to be understood, and knowing from experience that that need is not getting met here. It's not going to be met. Um, at this point, if what I started to melt down over was that we didn't go to the place I thought we were going to, you can turn around and take me there at the preparation stage, and maybe as we're moving into the sensory overwhelm stage. But after that, it's not going to matter, because you are only taking me there to get me to shut up, and I know it. And autistic kids are so much more sensitive than they get credit for. That feeling of wanting to be supported and acknowledged as a respected human being, that when that is thwarted, the bad things can happen. For me, a meltdown has always just been crying, in most cases. I have had a few yelling and screaming ones and hitting my head on things. That can happen. But in general, they've been like long, long crying spells. When I was a child, I could cry for hours. I could not stop. It didn't matter what anyone did. Once I was past that point, it had to just play itself out, and that's what you have to do during any kind of meltdown. Um, you might want to address the behavior that's going on instead of the person, but that is going to be a mistake almost every time. What that person needs is a quiet and comforting presence. You need to follow their directions about how close you should be there, or if maybe you're not the right person to be there. If you're sitting quietly aside, uh, giving them time to recover, and they're getting worse rather than better, it may be that you're not going to be able to help this situation. But being available and not intrusive is the key. You want to make the person as comfortable as possible. Now, I know somebody is going to think, maybe more than one person is thinking this, that, oh, you're just reinforcing bad behavior here. If you are giving them water and blankets and favorite objects, why would we do that? Well, because we recognize that what's really going on here is not bad behavior, it is someone in pain. So give them some things that will be comforting to them, and make sure that whatever kind of communication they use is going to be supported and respected in this environment. If they need an device, AAC device, or app, they should have that, pencils, paper, whatever. Don't ask any questions when somebody's melting down. Don't try to figure it out right now. Don't ask them to do anything else. At this point, the meltdown has to run its course. Now, when the crisis has passed and the person has calmed down, then this is the time you go into action and you make a plan. So later on, you'll have a talk with them. You might say something like, last week at the library, I saw that you were really upset, and I'm wondering if you can tell me why. They may or may not be able to tell you why, and believe them if they can't. It is quite possible to know exactly what is wrong, but not know any words to explain that to another person. It's a hard place to be, and it only makes it worse when someone is staring at you, waiting for you to provide the answer that you're not capable of providing. Let them know that they did not do anything wrong and you're not mad. That the whole point of this conversation is to figure out how to help you be more comfortable when we're out and about, how to meet your needs. So ask them questions like, when you're upset, do you want someone to talk to you or not? Or sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Do you know the difference? Do you know what makes the difference there? Um, do you want Does it help if I ask you questions, or would you rather I not ask you questions? Does it help if I touch your shoulder? Or uh, with autistic people, if you want to give a hug, of course you get consent, but also in general, you want to give a very tight bear hug. That pressure is very, very comforting to some of us who have difficulty with feeling where our body is in space. And I sometimes feel like I don't have any boundaries. And I've heard other people talk about this too, that it's like we're disintegrating, and our selves are floating all over the place. And that tightness brings it back in. It puts us back together. So if they're not having trouble coming up with things to say to your questions, then talk about yourself a little bit. What helps you when you're upset, and how you want people to treat you when you're having a hard time, and see if this provokes any ideas, or if they say maybe, "Ooh, God, please don't ever do that." But now we're going to move into the environment part and talk about how that affects autistic people and what we can do to make a better environment so that um, these sensory overloads happen less frequently, because all of these things can be an issue. Fluorescent lights, especially, um, and the prevalence of epilepsy for autistic people is quite a bit higher, about 10 times the rate that it is for neurotypical people. So we're much more likely to be affected by fluorescent lights, and that can cause a seizure in someone with epilepsy. So it's really important to attend to that if you can. Provide areas that don't have that lighting. If you can't, you can't undo everything that's already made in your building, right? But you can disable the light fixture and put in some floor lamps and use those instead. Or you can have an area that has natural light available, which is always best. And you can have your groups for kids in those areas. Of course, noise and chatter and multiple people talking. Some autistic people and other neurodivergent people are super sensitive to certain smells and cannot be very close to certain foods. We tend to have more allergies, so that can apply to perfumes and colognes and shampoos and all of that stuff. In clothing, it's something to think about whether or not the person needs rough textures. Uh, I had the hardest time wearing any kind of pants other than denim as I moved from working in a restaurant to working in professional settings. I found that other kinds of pants just are so uncomfortable on my legs, and I had to really train myself to accept cotton chinos, and now I'm fine with those. But please, anything, if it's got any polyester in it, it's going to be unbearable. So to the point that I can't do my job because I can't focus on anything but how uncomfortable I am. Just like if you were uh, sitting in a pool of water, if your seat was wet and you weren't allowed to get up, um, you would not be able to focus on what you needed to do. You'd be so uncomfortable. And autistic people have needs for movement that are often misunderstood or not accepted. Some need to move around a lot. Others need to be incredibly still a lot, and either can draw a lot of criticism. Fine and gross motor skills can be very different from what you might think that you would see. So when we go about, does anybody want to talk about any of the things that I just talked about before we move on to how to design the sensory friendly environment? Oh my gosh, it's 11:45. Did y'all know that?
I don't see any questions, Bev. We have some nice comments, kind of expressing their own experience, but no questions yet.
All right. Well, great. That gives me another at least 10 minutes to talk. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through these because they are pretty self-explanatory. Um, as far as if you look at the pictures and words here, you don't really need me to narrate it for you. And I'll make sure that this slideshow is available to everyone so that you can read through it on your own and pick up anything that I didn't get time to get to. Um, Different kinds of seating, so important. Have some standing desk areas, have some bean bags, different things, and understand that sometimes sitting or lying down on the floor is the best way for somebody. It's awesome if you can have fidget items around for kids to use or adults to use. Most every autistic adult I know has a messenger bag or backpack full of these, one or two things anyway. I never go anywhere without one of my friends, um, but you want to make sure that they can have a movement break if they need to, because a person getting really all that energy, it needs to come out. And some people learn best when they're walking in a circle around the room, not sitting in a chair or sitting on the floor with their legs crossed in a certain way, right? Uh, of course, there's sometimes going to be an access conflict, which is one person needs it quiet, but one person really needs to be loud. And I find myself on both sides of that sometimes. I make bird sounds and I like to repeat back what people say and repeat myself and make a lot of sounds that people find obnoxious. I also need everyone around me to be perfectly quiet so I can concentrate. Thank you. Some things that you need to know when communicating with autistic people are: be calm, be clear, consistent, and respectful. Um, as an autistic adult, I can tell you we do not get the same kind of respect that our neurotypical colleagues get. And children, of course, rarely get the respect that adults get. And when you combine those two things together, you have got a very sensitive person here who is feeling slighted and unseen. So if your communication can be respectful and kind, that's great. But whoever made up that thing about, oh yeah, I think it was in the Bible. Okay. I probably shouldn't have said that. About the golden rule, doing unto others, that doesn't always work across different neurotypes. If you're neurotypical and I am neurodivergent, what works for you may not work for me. So if you think you're being polite and kind by telling me something nice before you say what you really want to say, which is negative, and then at the end, wrapping it up with something else positive, that is not a kindness to a person who has this type of communication difference, because you're burying the message. And now I have to go and look for it. And I might not think to look for it. I might just think, oh, the first thing they said, that was the point. The last thing they said, that was the point. So it's really important to be kind to an autistic person, is to be clear and consistent. Here's why. You can think of this like, according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you have your needs met for connection, you have an understanding that, usually your communication is going to be understood. Usually, people are going to relate to you okay. You have your needs basically met, then you can work, you can work on that kind of personal piece and then go to information. But if you are in a situation where you cannot count on understanding someone's communication or them understanding yours, then you've got to concentrate really hardly on receiving and sending the information. And I need you to be clear when you talk to me, and I need you to be transparent and not pretend that the question means one thing when it's really for another reason. And I need things to make sense. What the autistic person needs is for your request to make sense to them, for them to understand it. So, because I said so is never going to be an acceptable answer for the autistic child or adult. I just want to point out that our needs are exactly the same as your needs. And let's stop trying to frame this as special needs. Everybody needs nutrition, hydration, sleep, pain management or absence, a social support system, respect, and a tolerable sensory environment. You show up and you're ready to do the task, whether it's your job or having a conversation. If you've had those things, and I'm not saying that every non-autistic people has had all of those things each day, but if you can answer yes to those questions, and the more that you can, you're going to be fairly prepared to do the task compared to someone who is struggling with this. And I've listed here the reasons why autistic people may struggle with any of these things: sleep disorders, eating disorders, or issues with texture or flavors of food. Sometimes we have very restricted diets for different reasons. Um, and all of these other things, the social support system, the respect, and the tolerable sensory environment, are not things that the autistic person can automatically expect. So they may come in here with being at a 1.5 on the preparedness scale, whereas your typical children in the same group may be at a 7 to 9.5. One more thing I wanted to say was about social skills and training for that. A better way to approach it, rather than telling people what they have to do. I mean, if you have experience with trying to tell autistic people what they have to do, then you probably know that that's just not the best option. But explain what might happen. In this situation, you could respond in your natural way. But if you do, the circles or the typical people might become angry and you'll be blamed for any conflict. So, for example, in this case, they expect you to say that you like the gift, even if you hate it. And if you meet this expectation, they will like you better, but they may get you the same thing again next year. That gives the person all the information they need. Okay, if I am myself, people may respond poorly. If I put on an act, I can get what I want. They can make that decision rather than being told, you have to shake hands, you have to make eye contact, you have to greet someone by name. Understand that these things may be incredibly difficult and counterproductive. These are things that get in the way of our being able to hear and being able to communicate back to you. So I know I've taken up all my time here. Like I said, I'm going to make sure you get the slides. And every time I do a presentation, I tell myself to try to stay on topic. But I really think that it goes better when I say a few things that just come up. Um, when I let that autism show itself a little bit and try to be more present in the moment than just using a script. So I apologize for that, and I will make sure that you get what the slides and all of these recommendations about books. Um, these are for younger kids. This one is 2023, A Day with No Words. Highly, highly recommended if you want to learn about getting along with a non-speaking autistic child. And here for preteens, young adult fiction, nonfiction. These are especially ones that I would recommend for parents to read. Everything here is written by autistic people except for Uniquely Human by Barry Prezant, who has done some of the pioneering work in the meanings of echolalia. And here's a little kind of a rubric that you can use to make some decisions. If you're looking for information on this, here's what you might want to read. And here are some pointers for choosing books about autism. If you want something that is life affirming to share and not something that's judgmental and tells you how to fix the other person, then maybe look at this point system that I made up on the fly. But I guarantee you it's very accurate.